Our gospel reading, always on the first Sunday in Advent, is taken from the little apocalypses in the Gospels. And this Sunday it's taken from the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is speaking here. And he says this: "There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on the earth distress among the nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." Then he told to them a parable. "Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is already near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Be on guard, so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life, and that day catch you unexpectedly like a trap. For it will come upon all who live on the face of the whole world. Be alert at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that will take place, and to stand before the Son of Man." Well, that reading wasn't very Christmassy, was it? Distress among nations, fainting from fear and foreboding. I like the alliteration, but that's pretty much it. A day that catches you like a trap, heaven and earth passing away. Be alert. No. A preacher has to do some damage control after this apocalyptic reading on the first Sunday in Advent. I mean, it's time to gear up for Christmas, right? No one wants to hear stuff like this today. I think what Luke really means to say here is city sidewalks, busy sidewalks, dressed in holiday style. Right? Isn't that better? Isn't that a little more suitable for the season of Advent than pray that you might escape or have the strength to escape? Grumpy old Luke, he's just not in the Christmas spirit yet. Perhaps Luke, like me and like Maggie's brother, doesn't think it's quite time yet in November. Either that or I don't know. Maybe Luke's trying to say something bigger here, something that applies to all times. You're going to laugh at me, I guess. Maybe these strange words on the lips of Jesus in Luke's gospel are describing things that happen to people at all times, all people, in all places. Maybe it always feels like the end of the world, when divine possibility breaks into what we know and changes everything. Just like our regularly scheduled Christmas, new and unexpected things are forever befalling the world, and in their wings they always bear the promise of redemption, the promise of making things right, the promise of good change. Christmas comes each year, and though it's a little different every year, each time it's somehow the same. Maybe in the same way, this apocalypse that's described in Luke is forever coming upon us in new and in different ways, as individuals and as society. But in the end, it brings the same promise, the same possibility, the same kernel of redemption. If this is Luke's awkward Christmas card message to us this morning, think, what promise lies hidden in these days? These days in which we too might ask, what is coming upon the world? What is coming upon our worlds? You know, these ancient words in Luke's gospel are proof that people in all times and in all places always thought they were living at the very end of history. Everybody thought they lived in strange times. That's some comfort, isn't it? Everybody thought, this is really unprecedented. We heard that word a lot at the beginning of 2020. This is unprecedented. There's never been anything like this. And maybe they weren't altogether wrong. They did indeed live through a dying and a rebirthing of the world, as we are probably doing ourselves. I mean, think about it. If you were an adult in the late 30s and the early 40s, when all the living world was at war, it must have seemed to anyone living in Berlin or Paris or London that the world was coming to an end. It must have really seemed like the end of the world. The world they knew was coming to an end. Any sense of fragile safety or security they managed to get back after World War I was surely blasted away by World War II. And they, in their times, gazed at bomber jets flying in formation in the gray skies above their cities. And they must have asked, what is coming upon the world? And when, even earlier, the everlasting empire of Rome began to falter under the weight of its own greed and entitlement, as empires always will do, beset by inept leadership and political infighting, and yes, epidemics and religious unrest, and there's even some suggestion that there was changing climate involved. Sound familiar? Many of the Romans must have thought it was the end of the world. When the moneyed elite of Rome, their hands soft from idleness, who dined daily on the imported delicacies of their empire, before the final sieges against Rome ended, would wander through the streets looking for a blade of grass to eat. I always think about this. If you had never seen an elephant, and you saw an army on elephant backs, Hannibal, marching toward you, you would think you were in the Lord of the Rings. You would have no idea what is coming, what's happening. What are these creatures marching toward us? This must be the living end. Shock and panic and maybe fear and foreboding. And even they must have asked, what's happening to our world? What's happening? Or, more to Luke's point probably here, in 70 AD, if you'd been a regular old person in Jerusalem and you were standing by watching helplessly as the Romans pulled down your temple. There was once some adventure movie where it showed terrorists attacking the Capitol building in D.C. and the dome collapsing, and it was so horrible and so unthinkable. But that really happened to the people of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The center of their world, their temple, was pulled down and destroyed. The towers, the pillars, the great walls, the Holy of Holies, which they believed to be the dwelling place of God. Their whole life and identity was centered around that symbol. To see it destroyed was to see their God humiliated, everything they believed called into question. These are probably the people Luke had in mind when he tells us this story, when he talks about people's hearts failing them for fear, for they surely did when that happened in Jerusalem. And maybe Luke even heard it firsthand when that happened in Jerusalem. What's happening? What's coming upon our world? Just one more vignette. Back in the 1990s, when I was working for a public library, we were given a signed copy of a book about how globalization was going to create some worldwide epidemics back in the 90s. Now, I don't remember the book, and I don't remember the writer, but whoever that writer was, she was a person with a sense of humor. I remember it was a woman's name. It was a signed copy, and right beside her signature in marker, she had written very playfully, "The microbes are coming. The microbes are coming." And I thought it was so dreadful back then that it haunted me right until the day that the microbes came. All these years later. In many ways, we are not unlike the people in Jesus' day who sensed something strange afoot, as if our day in history is different from any other and somehow more perilous. We've got the wildfires and the droughts and the rising cost of food and the off-the-hook crazy behavior from political leaders that could remind you of some of those Roman Caesars and senators. Who could blame us if we in our day asked, what's coming? What's coming upon our world? Well, what do we say in Luke's defense here? I like to defend Luke because I like Luke. He's an elegant writer. How could he start off our joyful season of Advent with this melancholy cry? Don't we all need a little Christmas right this very minute? It's not Luke's fault that we began reading his book right here in chapter 21 and not at the beginning. He does have the Christmas spirit in other places. We just didn't catch him at a good minute, at a good moment. He is the only gospel writer who gives us the manger and the shepherds and the angel choir and Mother Mary's magnificent Magnificat. He has the Christmas spirit more than Mark and John. They don't have any Christmas stories. But Luke is saying something important here about the nature of change, about the way sometimes God has to break into history in big ways. Luke is writing shortly after the fall of Jerusalem, as I said, the most unthinkable thing in the world and in time had already occurred for most of Luke's readers. The one thing of permanence in all the earth, God's dwelling place on earth, was gone. The people of promise had been evicted from the promised land. But even amid the rubble and the fear and the confusion of those times, redemption is springing up amid the ruined foundations. And distress among nations, people fainting and their hearts failing them from fear, foreboding. Raise up your heads, he says. Redemption is drawing near. And then to a long-dead generation, Jesus says, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. And that generation has long since passed. But it happens in every generation, doesn't it? It happens in every generation, this call to change, this call to newness, this call to new life, this call to the kingdom. Every day is the final day, and redemption lies within it. Every day is the final day. How? Because every day bears within its unseen folds a grain of new possibility, a grain of potential, a grain of hope. And wherever there is change, there is an ending and a beginning. World-ending, world-altering calamities and catastrophes and plagues and wars, they have been present in every age, and into every life they have cast their long shadow. I mean, think about the things you could have said and thought and believed on September 10th, 2001, that by September 12th, 2001, you could no longer think or say or believe. Every world is fragile and changing. How many worlds have you known in your lifetime? Countless hundreds you've probably just stopped noticing. From your childhood world of wonder and innocence, the currents of your life have borne you to adolescence, where the waters were a little more choppy, and then on to adulthood and the many phases of adulthood. So much so that you probably no longer recall all the ways that the world has looked to you, all the things that you once knew to be true, all the things you've lived through and loved and experienced we forget they pass on. I mean, do you remember how we used to do our hair in the 1980s? It was bad. Sometimes I tell people I shave my head today just as penance for what I used to do to my poor hair in the 80s. The world changes. The world moves on, and that's, I guess, making light of it. More than that, there are big universal shifts, changes in our collective consciousness and our ways of being in the world. Do you remember that in 2004, Barack Obama came out against gay marriage? Do you remember that? In the 2000s, it was a hotly debated issue with the so-called Defense of Marriage Act, which was a last-ditch attempt to stop gay marriage. By 2015, when it became the law of the land, nobody batted an eye. And we started doing weddings here in this church for non-traditional couples. Nobody batted an eye. It was just 11 years later. A change had swept our world, and we had all moved along with it. Another one, it can be good or bad, whatever you think. I'm not putting a value judgment on it. Mississippi just recently sentenced, of course, a black man to life in prison for marijuana possession, 1.5 ounces. Life in prison. Whereas just 200 miles up the river in Illinois, a farmer can smoke weed and drive his tractor, as long as it's not on a public road. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but there you have it. And that strange change, that change will make its way downriver eventually. I don't know if it will make it in time for that poor guy spending his life in prison. But change is inexorable. It comes, it breaks in. If you approve of these shifts in our consciousness or not, they're not stopped. They happen. Things that we once saw as eternally abiding, our understanding of marriage, our understanding of crime, things that were once as sure and sacrosanct as the Jerusalem temple, they change. What is coming upon the world? The same as always. Death and rebirth, death and rebirth. Many years ago, a friend convinced me to read with him the Douglas Adams books. Is anybody familiar with those? They're science fiction books, but they're funny. And the writer, Douglas Adams, he was a British man, and he wrote what he called a trilogy in 6 books. It's a trilogy in 6 books. It's not the kind of stuff I normally read, comic science fiction, but back in college, especially, I wouldn't read that kind of thing. I was kind of fooled myself. But the books were funny. They were hilarious. And so I did. I read them. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was the first and the most popular of Adams's books. And in it, it has this quote. It says, "There is a theory which states that if ever anyone discovers exactly what the universe is for and why it is here, it will instantly disappear and be replaced by something even more bizarre and inexplicable." He goes on to say, "There is another theory which states that this has already happened." The second book in that series, in that trilogy of 6, was called The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. And it was about a restaurant that somebody had built. They had traveled in time and built on that day when the universe exploded or imploded or whatever the universe was going to do in that science fiction book. And people would travel to this upscale restaurant on their lunch breaks, and they would travel in time out to this restaurant and dine on poached eggs and creamed spinach, and watch as the universe exploded into nothingness, and then they would travel safely back to their offices and their workplaces and their homes. What is our fascination with these cataclysms, with the end of all things that we know? I mean, think of all the books and the movies and the TV shows that have been based on the idea that the world just ends and we have to start over. And to think that we find this apocalyptic language on the lips of Jesus in Mark 13 and Luke 21 and Matthew 24, and of course in the book of Revelation. And the misreading of that book of Revelation has brought more than its share of shame and embarrassment on the Christian faith. But Bible scholars tell us that this genre of apocalyptic literature, it's not just tragedy porn like much of the evening news is. It's usually a product of desperate people hoping for a big answer to their serious problems, where people really don't see a way out. They produce apocalyptic literature. People with no power, people with no voice, people with no vote. Of course, the biblical scholars are talking here about biblical texts, but what about our fascination with the end of the world? With the movies and the books and the TV shows about it? Maybe even the superhero action movies where somebody has to swoop in and save the world. I wonder if it's not the same thing. I wonder if it's not born out of our sense of feeling trapped in a dangerous world and wanting there to be some miraculous Savior coming to the rescue. In other words, if there was a sense of dread and foreboding afoot even in Jesus' times, and if there's one today, then isn't it just the human lot to live with this sense that big changes are coming and we don't know how to deal with them? I think it's our mortality playing tricks on us. I think it's the fact that we all know we're going to die, but we know that we are not meant for the grave. It's the fact that we are powerless over death in many ways. You know, this is the great mystery of humanity. We are finite. We're going to die. We are infinite. We know somehow within ourselves that we have touched on something bigger, something eternal. And we cannot put those two things together without it making us just a little bit crazy, just a little bit anxious, maybe more than a little bit. The fact that we're finite is very obvious. We live in these perishable bodies. We're bound to the limits of time and space. We will die and go the way of all flesh. But the second truth, the fact that we're infinite, it feels more like a suspicion than a fact because we can't prove it. We can find evidence of it. We can find traces of it. We can think in our own imaginations of things that ought to be, and isn't that evidence that things could be different? We can imagine a world that's not. We can wonder at the lives that we could have lived and didn't. We can think about what it would be to be somebody else. We can grasp big ideas like goodness, truth, beauty. We can live according to principles. In a moment of love or well-being, we can know that our lives are bigger than the things we're scared of. We are both finite and infinite, and it makes us a little crazy, I think. Being mortal, but being able to imagine immortality, that causes anxiety. That's some heady stuff. Some cope with it by staying busy, by keeping in the shallow end of the pool, by not thinking about it, by occupying their time with other things. They deny it. Others cope with it by acknowledging it, but numbing the pain with every numbing agent known to humanity. And you know the ones I'm talking about. Others rail against it. They say, no, not me. I am the master of my own fate. I am the captain of my own soul. I can resist it with my own intelligence, my own power. And they say it even as they disappear beyond the veil. Søren Kierkegaard, that Danish philosopher, said that there is a fourth way to be when confronted with the crippling fact that we're finite and infinite somehow. Kierkegaard said that instead of flitting about and denying it, or instead of numbing the pain, or instead of raging against it, we can accept it. We can accept our finitude and see ourselves as a part of something beautiful and good and eternal that we've been given the privilege to take part in. In other words, see ourselves as part of something bigger and not just see ourselves as our small selves. You know the joy that you feel when you're part of a group that you can really be proud of or happy about? Say when your team wins, or when you're just one voice in an outstanding choir and nobody can really hear your individual voice, but the choir itself sounds fantastic. Or maybe even when your city is named the most livable for like the umpteenth time. That glory doesn't belong to you as an individual, but you get a part in it. You get a share in it. A person can be grounded in their share in eternity, their God-given identity as a child of the big picture, the big whole of God's life being lived out in history. A person who does not complete history, but without whom history would be incomplete. Not the main character in the drama of time, but one without whom it could not be. Belonging to eternity, dwelling in time, a part of the very life of God. How freeing it is to be small and loved, isn't it? Like a child. What is coming upon the world? People have been asking this question in every age, as calamities and shifts and epidemics and the winds of change have rocked their sense of security. What is coming upon the world? The same thing as ever. Death and rebirth. Death and rebirth. To paraphrase my favorite theologian, Paul Tillich, time has a hidden goal, which is the redemption of all things. Time has a hidden meaning, which is the coming kingdom. Time has a hidden hope, which is the new creation. Hope. Hope. Though the earth should change, and it probably should, though the earth should change, we abide in hope. For all the changes in this world are pretty much the same thing, an end to one thing and a start to something else. Distress among nations, fear and foreboding, pandemics and inflation, this has all been done before. This is not new to humanity nor to God. We will not be afraid. We are tempted to overreact. We are tempted to panic. We are tempted to lash out in anger and in fear, but let us breathe deeply and call to mind the truth that we are taking part in eternity. Eternity is taking part in us. We live and we move and we have our being in the mystery that is being revealed in time. There is no fear. We live our lives in God. Amen.